March 1944. A pale winter sun hung low over the rooftops of Berlin. The city was quiet for a moment. The strange, tense silence that often came just before the air raid sirens began to howl. Then the distant sound arrived. At first it was faint, a deep mechanical rumble somewhere high beyond the clouds. Within minutes it grew into a steady thunder rolling across the sky. Anti-aircraft crews moved to their guns. Radar operators tracked the incoming formation. Civilians glanced upward, already familiar with the sound of American bombers approaching. But on this day, something was different. German fighter controllers studying their scopes noticed additional aircraft flying far ahead and above the bomber stream. Fast, agile, moving with the formations instead of waiting to intercept them. When observers finally saw them clearly, the realization spread through command centers and airfields alike. These were not bombers. They were long-range American fighters. The sleek silhouettes of the North American P-51 Mustang had appeared over the German capital itself. For years, leaders of the Luftwaffe had believed such a moment would never come. And according to a remark widely attributed to Hermann Göring, if American escort fighters were ever seen above Berlin, it would mean Germany had already lost the war. Now they were here, and the balance of the air war was about to change forever. In the opening years of the Second World War, the skies above Europe belonged almost entirely to one force, the Luftwaffe. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, its Air Force demonstrated a new form of warfare. German aircraft did not simply fight other planes. They operated as part of a carefully coordinated system that supported armored columns, paralyzed enemy communications, and shattered resistance from the air. During the invasions of Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, German aircraft dominated the battlefield. Dive bombers such as the Ju-87 Stuka struck enemy positions with terrifying precision. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 cleared the skies ahead of advancing German troops. The result was devastating. Within months, much of Europe had fallen under German control. Even when Germany turned west toward Britain in 1940, the Luftwaffe still appeared nearly unstoppable. During the Battle of Britain, German bombers and fighters launched massive attacks against British airfields, cities, and industry. Although Britain ultimately resisted the assault, the Luftwaffe remained one of the most formidable air forces in the world. But while Germany dominated the early years of the war, a different kind of strategy was slowly forming across the Atlantic. In the United States, military planners believed that air power could cripple an enemy's ability to fight. Rather than targeting only cities or troops, they envisioned destroying the industrial systems that powered modern warfare: factories, oil refineries, transportation hubs, and aircraft plants. This concept became known as daylight precision bombing. American bombers were designed to fly in tight defensive formations during daylight hours. Heavy machine guns mounted across the aircraft allowed them to defend themselves collectively, creating overlapping fields of fire against enemy fighters. Aircraft like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress embodied this philosophy. With thick armor, heavy defensive guns, and large bomb loads, the B-17 was built to survive intense combat. Later, the even longer-range consolidated B-24 Liberator joined the campaign. But there was one major problem: range. As American bombers began operating from bases in Britain in 1942 and 1943, they could strike industrial targets across occupied Europe. However, The deeper the bombers flew into Germany itself, the more vulnerable they became. Early escort fighters could protect them for part of the journey. Aircraft such as the P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire could accompany bomber formations across the English Channel and into Western Europe. But they simply did not have the fuel capacity to travel all the way into central Germany. Eventually, the escorts had to turn back, and that left the bombers alone. German fighter controllers understood this pattern well. Radar stations tracked incoming bomber streams and calculated exactly where American escorts would be forced to withdraw. Once the fighters turned back toward England, German interceptors would attack. Pilots flying aircraft such as the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the Bf-109 climbed to meet the bombers in large formations. They approached from the front, the sides, and from above, concentrating fire on the vulnerable heavy aircraft. The bombers fought back fiercely, but the losses were severe. One of the most devastating examples occurred in October 1943 during the second Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. American bombers attacked German ball bearing factories deep inside Germany, targets considered essential to the German war industry. Without full fighter escort for the entire mission, the bomber formations faced relentless attacks from German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The results shocked American commanders. Out of 291 bombers sent on the mission, 60 were shot down. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. The loss rate was unsustainable. If such losses continued, daylight bombing missions into Germany would simply become impossible. American planners faced a stark reality. Their strategy depended on reaching deep into the German heartland. But without long-range escort fighters, bombers would continue to suffer catastrophic losses. The war in the air had reached a dangerous stalemate. German fighters could still intercept bombers before they reached their most important targets. The Luftwaffe remained strong enough to challenge Allied air power over the heart of Germany. But far away in aircraft factories and engineering offices, a new solution was already taking shape. A fighter aircraft that could travel farther than any escort before it. An aircraft that would soon change the entire balance of the air war. And when it finally arrived above Germany, even the commanders of the Luftwaffe would realize something irreversible had begun. The solution to the bomber escort problem did not begin as a revolutionary idea. In fact, the aircraft that would eventually transform the air war started as a routine design request. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached the American aviation company North American Aviation with a proposal. Britain needed more fighters for the war already raging across Europe. At first, the British simply wanted American factories to produce additional versions of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. But engineers at North American Aviation believed they could design something better. Within an astonishingly short time, they created a completely new aircraft. The result was the North American P-51 Mustang. At first, the Mustang showed promise but not dominance. Early versions performed well at lower altitudes and were fast and maneuverable, but they lacked the high-altitude performance needed for escorting heavy bombers over Europe. What transformed the aircraft into something extraordinary was its engine. British engineers experimented with installing the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the Mustang's airframe. The results were dramatic. The Merlin engine delivered exceptional performance at high altitude, precisely where bomber formations operated. When the United States adopted this configuration for large-scale production, the Mustang became one of the most capable fighter aircraft of the war. But the true revolution was not just speed or altitude. It was range. With external fuel tanks, The P-51 could escort bomber formations deep into enemy territory and return safely. This meant American fighters could now remain with bomber formations throughout nearly the entire mission. For the first time, heavy bombers attacking Germany would not be left alone. By late 1943 and early 1944, Mustangs began operating regularly from airfields in Britain. Units of the United States Army Air Forces started flying long-range escort missions across occupied Europe. The difference was immediate. Where earlier escorts had been forced to turn back before reaching Germany's industrial heartland, Mustangs continued flying alongside the bombers. They protected the formations, intercepted German fighters, and increasingly began hunting enemy aircraft aggressively. Instead of merely defending bombers, Mustang pilots often flew ahead of the formations, searching for German interceptors as they climbed from their airfields. German fighter units suddenly faced a new threat. Instead of attacking slow bomber formations without interference, they now encountered fast, heavily armed fighters determined to destroy them before they could even reach the bombers. For the Luftwaffe, this change created an entirely new and dangerous situation. German fighter pilots had long relied on striking bomber formations quickly and withdrawing before escort fighters could respond. Now the escorts were already there, waiting. Even more alarming was the distance these aircraft could travel. Mustangs were now appearing far deeper over Germany than any Allied fighter had before. Their range meant they could accompany bomber formations across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. And eventually, that distance carried them to a place that had once seemed unreachable: the German capital itself. By early 1944, American bombers were increasingly targeting the industrial and transportation systems around Berlin. These missions were among the most dangerous of the entire air war. The city was heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns, radar networks, and large formations of German fighters. For years, the Luftwaffe had expected that Allied bombers attempting such deep missions would eventually be isolated and vulnerable. But the arrival of the Mustang changed that calculation. During several major bombing raids in early 1944, American escort fighters were now seen flying alongside the bomber formations over the German capital. Observers on the ground could see them clearly. Long, narrow wings, streamlined fuselages, silver aircraft weaving above the bombers. The sight carried a meaning that many German commanders immediately understood. For years, the Luftwaffe leadership had promised that enemy fighters would never reach Germany's most protected skies. Now they had. And according to a remark frequently attributed to Hermann Göring, he had once declared that if American escort fighters were ever seen flying over Berlin, it would mean Germany had already lost the war. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, the moment symbolized something undeniable. The strategic balance of the air war had shifted. The bombers were no longer alone, and in the months that followed, the skies above Germany would become the stage for some of the most intense aerial battles of the entire conflict. Because once the Mustangs arrived, the war in the air changed for everyone involved. For the men inside American bomber formations, the arrival of long-range escort fighters meant the difference between survival and near certainty of loss. Crews flying aircraft such as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator had already experienced some of the most dangerous missions of the war. A bomber crew typically consisted of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and several gunners positioned across the aircraft. Every mission meant hours inside freezing temperatures at altitudes often exceeding 25,000 feet. Oxygen masks were required just to breathe. Frost formed along metal surfaces inside the aircraft. Engine noise never stopped. But the greatest danger came when German fighters appeared. Before the arrival of long-range escorts, bomber crews often watched their fighter protection disappear behind them somewhere over Western Europe. Once the escorts turned back toward England, the bomber formations continued alone. German interceptors would soon follow. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 attacked in coordinated waves. Some approached head-on, firing heavy cannon directly into the bomber formations. Others attacked from above or behind, aiming for engines and cockpits. Bomber gunners fought back with .50 caliber machine guns, creating defensive crossfire around the formation. But even with this protection, the losses were brutal. Crews watched aircraft explode in mid-air. Some bombers fell away trailing smoke and fire. Others slowly drifted out of formation with damaged engines. Occasionally, parachutes appeared in the sky, small white shapes descending through the chaos. The arrival of escort fighters changed the emotional landscape of these missions almost immediately. When Mustangs appeared alongside the bomber formations, crews felt something they had rarely experienced before: protection. Instead of waiting helplessly for German interceptors, bomber crews could now see American fighters weaving above them and along the edges of the formation. Silver shapes circling the bombers. Ready. It did not eliminate the danger. Bombing Germany remained one of the deadliest assignments in the Allied military. But the presence of the North American P-51 Mustang meant that the bombers were no longer alone in hostile skies. For many crews, that simple fact changed everything. For the young fighter pilots flying escort missions, the war over Europe demanded a different kind of endurance. Pilots of the North American P-51 Mustang were often in their early 20s. Many had trained in the United States only months earlier before being sent to airfields across Britain. From those bases, they launched some of the longest fighter missions of the entire war. Escort flights could last 6 hours or more. After takeoff, Mustangs climbed into position alongside the bomber formations as they crossed the English Channel. From there, the fighters accompanied the bombers across occupied Europe and deep into German territory. Fuel management became a constant concern. Pilots carefully monitored engine performance and fuel consumption while switching between internal tanks and external drop tanks. The margin for error was small. A mistake could mean running out of fuel hundreds of miles from friendly territory. But the missions were not only about endurance. Combat could erupt at any moment. German fighters frequently attempted to intercept the bombers before they reached their targets. When that happened, Mustang pilots moved quickly to engage. Dogfights unfolded across enormous stretches of sky. Aircraft twisted through tight turns. Machine guns fired in brief, violent bursts. Pilots searched constantly for enemy fighters approaching from behind or diving from above. Unlike earlier escort fighters that focused primarily on staying close to the bombers, Mustang pilots increasingly adopted a more aggressive approach. They hunted. Instead of waiting for German aircraft to attack, they pushed forward to intercept enemy fighters as they climbed from their bases. This strategy disrupted German interception plans and forced the Luftwaffe to fight American fighters before they could even reach the bomber formations. It was dangerous work, but it slowly began shifting the balance of the air war. For German fighter pilots, the appearance of long-range Allied escorts marked the beginning of a much harsher phase of the conflict. Pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 had spent years defending German territory against Allied bombing raids. Earlier in the war, attacking American bomber formations had been difficult but manageable. German fighters could concentrate their attacks once Allied escorts turned back. The bombers were heavily armed, but they were also slow and predictable. Interception tactics evolved accordingly. German fighters often attacked in groups, striking quickly before pulling away to prepare for another pass. But the arrival of Mustangs changed that environment almost overnight. Now German pilots encountered escort fighters that could follow them deep into the battle zone. Instead of approaching bombers freely, they had to fight their way through aggressive American fighters first. The skies above Germany became far more crowded and far more dangerous. For experienced German pilots, survival depended on skill, timing, and luck. For the growing number of inexperienced replacements entering combat by 1944, the situation was even worse. Every interception mission now risked turning into a dogfight against escort fighters before the bombers could even be reached. And as these encounters multiplied, the pressure on the German air defense system began to grow. Because beyond the pilots themselves, an entire strategy was now being tested in the skies above Germany. By 1943, the defense of German airspace had become one of the most complex military systems in the world. The entire structure was controlled by the Luftwaffe, which had built a laid network designed to detect, track, and destroy incoming Allied bombers long before they reached critical targets. The system began with radar. Across occupied Europe and Western Germany, radar stations scanned the skies for incoming aircraft. Once bomber formations were detected crossing the English Channel, the information moved quickly through command centers. Controllers calculated the direction, altitude, and speed of the incoming formations. From there, interceptor units were alerted. German fighter bases across northern France, the Netherlands, and Germany scrambled aircraft within minutes. Pilots rushed into cockpits while ground crews started engines and prepared the aircraft for immediate takeoff. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190 climbed rapidly to meet the bombers. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft defenses were also preparing. Cities like Berlin were surrounded by enormous anti-aircraft networks. Hundreds of heavy guns, known as flak, could fire thousands of shells into the sky, creating dangerous explosions around bomber formations. In theory, this integrated defense system should have made large bombing raids extremely costly for the Allies. For a time, it did. But the arrival of long-range escorts gradually disrupted the entire structure. German fighter units now had to fight through American escort fighters before they could even approach the bombers. Mustang pilots often intercepted German aircraft while they were still climbing toward the bomber formations. The result was chaos in the interception process. Instead of coordinated attacks against bombers, German fighters were forced into scattered engagements against American escorts. This reduced the effectiveness of their attacks and exposed them to increasing losses. The carefully organized air defense network began to lose its precision, and with every mission, the pressure on the German system grew. At the top of the German air war stood one man, Hermann Göring. As commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Goring had once been one of the most powerful figures in the German military. A decorated fighter pilot from the First World War, He had helped build the Luftwaffe into a formidable force during the 1930s. In the early years of the war, those efforts appeared successful. German aircraft dominated the skies during the invasions of Poland, France, and much of Europe. The Luftwaffe supported armored offensives and overwhelmed enemy air forces with speed and coordination. But by 1943 and 1944, the situation had changed dramatically. Allied aircraft production had expanded at a massive scale. American and British factories were producing thousands of aircraft every month. Meanwhile, German industry struggled to keep pace under increasing bombing attacks. As bombing raids intensified, German leaders demanded answers. Adolf Hitler repeatedly questioned why Allied bombers continued reaching German cities. Goring had once promised that enemy bombers would never be allowed to attack the German homeland. Those promises now sounded increasingly hollow. The appearance of long-range escort fighters over Germany made the problem even worse. According to several wartime accounts, Goring had once remarked that if American escort fighters were ever seen flying above Berlin, the war would effectively be lost. Whether the statement was spoken exactly in those words remains debated among historians. But the sentiment reflected a real fear inside the German leadership. Because once Allied fighters could reach Berlin, it meant the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee control of its own skies. And that realization carried enormous strategic consequences. The story of the Mustang was not just about one aircraft. It represented the enormous industrial power behind the Allied war effort. Aircraft like the North American P-51 Mustang were produced in vast numbers by American factories. Improvements in engine design, fuel capacity, and aerodynamics transformed what had once been a promising fighter into one of the most effective long-range escorts of the war. But the aircraft itself was only part of the equation. The United States possessed the industrial capacity to build thousands of aircraft while simultaneously producing the engines, ammunition, spare parts, and trained pilots needed to operate them. This scale of production meant that the Allies could sustain long and costly air campaigns without collapsing their own resources. Germany faced a very different reality. By 1944, German aircraft factories were increasingly under attack by Allied bombers. Fuel shortages began affecting pilot training programs and combat operations. Experienced pilots lost in combat were replaced by younger, less trained aviators. The technological balance of the air war was shifting. What had once been Germany's greatest advantage, air power, was slowly becoming one of its greatest weaknesses. And in the coming months, this transformation would reach its most intense moment in the skies above Germany. Because the arrival of long-range escorts did more than protect bombers. It forced the Luftwaffe into a battle of survival. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had entered a new and decisive phase. The Allies had reached a clear conclusion. Destroying Germany's ability to wage war required more than isolated bombing raids. It demanded sustained attacks against the industries that powered the German military machine. Aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, oil refineries, transportation networks. To accomplish this, the United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force began coordinating a massive strategic air offensive against the German aviation industry. The campaign became known as Big Week. Beginning in February 1944, hundreds of Allied bombers launched repeated strikes against aircraft factories across Germany. The goal was clear: force the Luftwaffe into the air and destroy it in large numbers. This time, however, the bombers would not be alone. Long-range escort fighters now accompanied the formations across nearly the entire route. Among them were growing numbers of the sleek new North American P-51 Mustang. From airfields across England, bomber streams formed in the cold morning sky. Hundreds of heavy aircraft, including the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator, assembled into tight formations before crossing the English Channel. Above and around them flew the escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, Spitfires, and increasingly, P-51 Mustangs. As the formations pushed deeper into Europe, the Mustangs continued flying with them, their long-range fuel tanks allowing them to travel far beyond the limits that had once restricted Allied escorts. German radar soon detected the incoming formations. Across occupied Europe, air defense networks transmitted warnings through command centers. Fighter bases prepared for takeoff as pilots rushed toward their aircraft. Within minutes, German fighters were climbing to intercept. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190 raced upward toward the approaching bombers. But now something had changed. Before the German fighters could even reach the bomber formations, they encountered the escort fighters waiting above and around the bombers. American pilots had adopted a new tactic. Instead of staying tightly attached to the bomber boxes, many escorts now ranged ahead of the formations. Their goal was simple: destroy German fighters before they could organize a coordinated attack. The skies across Germany quickly filled with swirling aerial combat. Mustangs dived toward climbing interceptors. German fighters attempted to break through the escorts to reach the bombers. Machine guns flashed in brief bursts as aircraft twisted through steep turns and rapid climbs. In earlier years, German fighters often attacked bombers repeatedly with carefully organized strikes. Now those attacks were increasingly disrupted. Some German aircraft were forced into dogfights with escort fighters before they could even approach the bombers. Others broke away entirely rather than risk combat against aggressive American escorts. The result was exactly what Allied planners had hoped for. German fighter losses began to climb. The Luftwaffe still possessed skilled pilots and powerful aircraft, but the constant battles with escort fighters were draining its strength. Every mission now risked the loss of experienced pilots, men who could not easily be replaced. Meanwhile, the bombers continued toward their targets. Factories and industrial centers across Germany came under increasing attack. Aircraft production facilities, fuel plants, and transportation hubs were struck repeatedly. The damage was serious. But the most important result of the campaign was not simply the destruction of factories. It was a growing battle in the skies themselves. Every major bombing raid forced the Luftwaffe to respond. And every time German fighters rose to meet the bombers, they now faced escort fighters determined to destroy them. Gradually, the balance of the air war began to shift. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting isolated bomber formations. It was fighting an entire aerial system: bombers, escorts, and an industrial machine capable of replacing its losses. The change became even more dramatic as bombing missions began striking deeper into Germany than ever before. Targets around the capital itself were now within reach. And during several major raids in 1944, American escort fighters were seen flying over the city that had once seemed untouchable. Berlin. For the German leadership, the site carried a meaning that went far beyond a single mission. Because if Allied fighters could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin, the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the heart of Germany was beginning to collapse. And the air battles over Germany were only becoming more intense. By the spring of 1944, the air war above Germany had become a relentless struggle of endurance. Every week, massive bomber formations appeared again over the Reich. Aircraft from the United States Army Air Forces crossed the English Channel in growing numbers, striking industrial targets deeper inside German territory. And now they came with protection. The North American P-51 Mustang had become a constant presence above the bomber streams. Its range allowed it to escort missions hundreds of miles into Germany and remain there long enough to challenge any interceptor that attempted to approach the bombers. This changed the rhythm of the air war. German fighters still rose to meet incoming raids. Pilots climbed into aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, racing upward toward the high-altitude bomber formations. But the moment they approached the battle zone, they encountered something new. Escort fighters were already waiting. Mustang pilots now patrolled aggressively around bomber formations. Some flew high above the bombers, scanning the sky for incoming interceptors. Others ranged miles ahead, searching for German aircraft before they could organize their attack runs. Dogfights erupted across wide stretches of the German sky. American fighters dove toward climbing German interceptors, forcing them into combat far from the bombers. In some cases, German pilots were attacked before they even reached the altitude needed to engage the bomber formations. This was precisely the outcome Allied planners had hoped to achieve. The Luftwaffe was being forced into a battle of attrition, and it was a battle Germany could no longer afford. During these months, German fighter losses increased sharply. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat were now facing fresh Allied fighter units flying aircraft with excellent range and performance. The situation became even worse because of Germany's growing fuel shortage. Training programs for new pilots were shortened as aviation fuel became scarce. Replacement pilots often arrived at the front with far fewer training hours than their predecessors. The difference in experience was deadly. American escort fighters increasingly dominated the airspace around the bomber formations. While the Luftwaffe still fought fiercely, it was slowly losing its most valuable resource: skilled, experienced fighter pilots. Every battle over Germany cost them more men. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft production continued to expand. Factories in the United States produced thousands of aircraft every month, including bombers, fighters, engines, and spare parts. Losses that might cripple a smaller air force could be replaced far more easily by the Allied industrial system. This imbalance began to show in the skies. Throughout 1944, large-scale air battles took place over major German cities and industrial regions. Missions targeting aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks forced German defenders to fight repeatedly under increasingly difficult conditions. During several major raids on Berlin, observers reported seeing American escort fighters moving freely around the bomber formations. The image carried powerful symbolic weight. For years, the leadership of the Luftwaffe had promised that the German homeland would remain protected from such threats. Yet now Allied fighters were appearing above the capital itself. The moment reflected a deeper reality. The Luftwaffe was no longer able to guarantee control of German airspace. The consequences soon became visible across the entire war. As German fighter strength declined, Allied bombers gained increasing freedom to attack critical targets. Oil facilities, transportation lines, and industrial plants came under sustained pressure. Fuel production began to collapse. Aircraft factories struggled to maintain output. German ground forces, already fighting on multiple fronts, faced growing shortages of fuel and equipment. The air war had reached its turning point. The appearance of long-range escort fighters over Germany had not destroyed the Luftwaffe in a single battle. Instead, it had forced the German Air Force into a slow, exhausting struggle it could no longer win. And by the time Allied armies prepared to invade Western Europe, the outcome in the skies had already begun to shape the future of the war. Because control of the air would soon prove decisive far beyond the bomber missions themselves. By mid-1944, the consequences of sustained Allied air operations were impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force in Europe, found itself increasingly unable to defend German airspace. Long-range escort fighters, especially the North American P-51 Mustang, had permanently shifted the balance. German fighter units faced relentless attrition, losing experienced pilots at a rate they could not replace. Even seasoned aces found themselves outmatched in extended engagements. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin symbolized a larger strategic failure. For the first time, the capital was no longer safely beyond the reach of enemy air power. Flak batteries and radar networks alone could not stop the combination of bomber formations and their fighter escorts. At the same time, morale among German pilots and commanders began to erode. Interceptions that had once been carefully orchestrated became chaotic. Pilots were forced into hasty engagements, often without sufficient intelligence about the approaching formations. Every mission risked the loss of irreplaceable human resources. Industrial production also suffered under repeated bombing raids. Aircraft factories were targeted relentlessly, limiting the Luftwaffe's ability to replace lost planes. Maintenance facilities, supply depots, and fuel refineries were similarly affected, further constraining operational capacity. Meanwhile, Allied crews grew more confident. B-17 and B-24 formations, once highly vulnerable, now benefited from constant protection. Mustangs engaged enemy fighters aggressively, reducing bomber losses and enabling missions deeper into Germany than ever before. The strategic impact was clear. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the air. German defenses were reacting instead of dictating the terms of engagement. The momentum had decisively shifted, and the Allies now held the initiative in the skies above Europe. This loss of control would prove critical in the coming months, particularly as Allied forces prepared for a major continental invasion. the ability to strike at German infrastructure and industry with reduced losses strengthened both operational planning and strategic confidence. The stage was set for the next phase of the war, one in which the Luftwaffe would struggle to recover from attrition, and Allied air superiority would become a decisive factor in the liberation of Europe. As summer approached in 1944, the effects of Allied air superiority became undeniable. The German Air Force was no longer able to mount coherent, sustained defense over its own territory. Long-range escorts had shifted the strategic balance, allowing the Allies to strike deeper, with greater precision and far fewer losses than ever before. Critical infrastructure across Germany was now vulnerable. Fuel refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation hubs were repeatedly targeted by bombing raids. The destruction of oil production crippled the Luftwaffe's operational capacity, limiting the number of missions it could launch. Trained pilots, already scarce, were grounded due to fuel shortages or lost entirely in combat. Replacement programs could not keep pace with attrition. Industrial output, too, felt the pressure. Factories rebuilt after one raid were often hit again before they could reach full capacity. The Allied combination of persistent bombing and fighter escort dominance ensured that Germany's war production could no longer recover. This shift in air power also had profound implications for the ground war. German armies, heavily dependent on fuel and supplies, faced increasing shortages. Tank units and mechanized divisions struggled to maneuver effectively, constrained by the logistical damage inflicted from the air. The Allies' ability to interdict supply lines further weakened German defenses along the Western Front. By June 1944, when the Normandy landings began, Allied air superiority had already shaped the battlefield. German reinforcements faced constant harassment from both strategic bombers and fighter patrols. The Luftwaffe could no longer mass enough aircraft to challenge the invasion effectively. The skies over France were dominated by Allied fighters, ensuring that ground operations could proceed under significantly reduced aerial threat. Even psychologically, the presence of long-range Allied fighters altered the German command's perception of the war. Goring and other Luftwaffe leaders had long relied on the Air Force's supremacy to protect the Reich and support ground operations. The persistent appearance of Mustangs deep over German territory shattered that confidence. Decision-making became cautious, reactive, and increasingly desperate. The cumulative effect was decisive. Germany's ability to defend its cities, its infrastructure, and its front lines have been undermined by a combination of industrial power, advanced aircraft, and aggressive tactics. The arrival of long-range escort fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, was the key factor enabling this shift. In the skies above Germany, the war had reached a tipping point. From Berlin to the industrial Ruhr, the Luftwaffe was on the defensive. Every mission was fought under pressure, every engagement costly, and every bombing raid, escorted by relentless American fighters, brought the Allies closer to crippling the German war machine. The stage was now set for the final phases of the air war and for the eventual liberation of Europe. The Allies had achieved something that had seemed impossible only a year before: control of the skies over Germany, a control that would prove crucial in determining the outcome of the conflict. The appearance of the North American P-51 Mustang over Berlin was more than a tactical achievement. It was a symbolic turning point in the Second World War, a moment when technology, strategy, and industrial might converged to shift the balance irreversibly. For the Luftwaffe, it was a signal that the era of unquestioned dominance had ended. Years of victories, carefully orchestrated defenses, and heroic pilots could not withstand the relentless pressure of a technologically advanced opponent operating with unparalleled industrial support. Every mission, every engagement, further depleted Germany's capacity to resist. The skies that had once protected the Reich became a battlefield the Germans could no longer control. For the Allies, the Mustang represented the culmination of ingenuity and production on a scale unmatched in history. It was not simply an aircraft, it was a force multiplier, enabling bombers to strike deep into enemy territory with reduced losses, preserving both crews and equipment, and ensuring that the broader strategy of crippling German industry could succeed. It was a tangible example of how innovation, logistics, and tactical foresight could determine the outcome of a war. The psychological impact was equally profound. Goring's reported realization that the war was lost the moment escort fighters reached Berlin captured a truth that resonated throughout the German command. The balance of power had shifted, not through a single battle, but through a series of cumulative pressures that began with the arrival of a fighter that could reach the heart of Germany. Looking back, the Mustang over Berlin stands as a testament to the way individual technologies can reshape entire conflicts. It symbolizes the intersection of human courage, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation. It was the moment when the sky above Germany quietly changed sides, signaling the beginning of the end for the Third Reich's air power, and foreshadowing the liberation of Europe that would soon follow. In war, as in history, some moments are remembered for their immediacy. Others are remembered for their inevitability. The day the P-51s appeared over Berlin belongs to both dramatic, cinematic, and yet, in hindsight, an unstoppable force that changed everything.